Terrell here, and I'm back again with another review. This time for Superpowered, the DC story coming to HBO. Oh, I'm sorry, coming to Max, HBO, whatever, coming to Max. It's going to be a three-part documentary on DC Comics, just DC media in general. About 55 minutes a piece each episode. And I wasn't expecting. I don't know what I was expecting going into this. I didn't watch any trailers or anything. Um, Watched all three episodes and pretty much kind of goes over the almost 80-year history of DC Comics and its involved evolution, what it's had to do to survive, the key players that were at DC Comics, some of the shiesty things they've done at DC Comics, a lot of the flagship characters, so on and so on. One of the things that I definitely noticed while I was watching this is, of course, they're going to use a lot of the footage for the movies and the TV shows and stuff throughout the documentary. Which, if you've been following a lot of the Arrowverse, and if you've been watched any of the last Batman, Superman, anything movies of the last 5 years, you'll definitely see a lot of that footage. One of the first things they talk about was kind of like obviously the origin of DC Comics and where it got started. They talk about Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, kind of how he was one of the originators of the comic of DC Comics, but he really didn't have the business side of it down pack, and how DC was, or what it was at that time, it was acquired and became DC Comics. Was taken over by pretty much rich white tycoons. You know what I mean? Like people that don't care about the industry, and they just really want to see. They just really want to see profit at the end of the day. Like, you know what I mean? Like if you working for a business, the most important thing to them is profit, not readers. Like who's reading it, X Y Z. And one of the things they really put a big highlight on, especially in like part one of this documentary, is Superman. Superman is probably, if not everything to DC Comics. One of the many reasons why it's still around it today. And we all know, the original, Joel Shuster and they created the original comics. And they talk about a lot of how they would just pretty much get over on creators, especially those two, and how Superman was pretty much the booming start for DC Comics. Back when Action Comics was a thing, and pretty much like DC DC riding on the coattails of Superman. But they also talk about when that originally first came out, that it didn't initially catch on. Comic books were not I would say it's super popular at that time, and they were trying to find different niches because like a lot of comic books were the same. And I just want to make sure I get this right. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, like they were the creators of Superman, and this is also during that time too where even now, like the creative rights of a character are not retained necessarily by the creators, but by the company that they're under the publisher. I want to say a lot of that has changed now, but I feel like we're still dealing with a lot of the backlash of it today. With when it comes to like Marvel and all comic books, shonen, whatever it may be, dealing with a lot of that and who gets paid for what. I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like everybody needs to be treated fairly. Everybody needs to get paid what they're due, especially them too. But eventually, they apparently they worked it out. But yeah, they talk about like Superman pretty much getting boosted up through TV and a lot of the radio shows, which really put that on the map. And then they start to see a lot of those comic books being sold. Myself, reading comic books over the years, reading a lot of the big events, going to a local comic book store, being a part of a lot of that. I definitely was very interested to see how a lot of these origins played out. I'm very surprised in this documentary there is raw on the information, because usually when you get something like this, they try to give you like a fluff piece about how DC was just the best thing. No, they flat out just say, hey, it was some grimy dudes at DC, and this some stuff wasn't right. They get into a lot of the origins of characters, what DC needed at the time. The creation of Superman brought in the creation of Batman, because DC wanted to make more money, as they say in this. Batman also led in the Wonder Woman, because there needed to be a bigger female presence, and a female superhero, that in the books, ironically created by a man. But they talk about a lot of how that early Trinity, those comics, man, really had the comics booming. And they talk about at the period of time that pretty much there was just no change. And in the comic book industry at that time, like, everybody's pretty much just doing the same thing. And everybody's trying to be the next, up each other, and innovative, and bring something new to the comics, and everything like that. But also bringing in, characters, like, more female characters, but not, I guess at that time doing comics, they were showing a little bit more skin. At that time, what they figured to be nude. Regardless, I feel like every time I see one of these comic book documentaries, they get into the comics code enforcement. Comics code enforcement seems to be like the nail in the coffin for a lot of people's freedoms. And I think they give a little bit more detail here than I've seen in like previous documentaries about how the comics code enforcement, pretty much like they just had a whole team of dudes just come in and just like redo your entire comic. What you couldn't show, what you could do. They talk about how you couldn't show law enforcement in a negative light. You couldn't show women as lead characters. You couldn't do it was wild rules to the comics code enforcement. But we were talking like the 1950s, and I'm not surprised. Bunch of white dudes and white women with nothing to do, just complaining about comics because they feel as though this is like shaping their children. Because like nobody likes to parent, comic books in video games. Everything's the problem, but you know what I mean? Like, and I think, especially as the creators, like, they're trying to innovate this business. They're trying to tell meaningful stories. They're trying to tell stories that are going to change people's lives. And it's always some feedback. Somebody's always got a problem with something. They show footage of like comic book burnings back then when the comics code enforcement pops off. Wild times. Luckily, I feel like by the time I came around, a lot of that chilled out. I feel like obviously the comics code enforcement is still around, but it's nowhere near as ridiculous as it was back then. I feel like by the time I got the comics, they maybe just like, probably had like a little thing where, you couldn't show drinking or something like that. Or talk about, but no, like I said, just nowhere near as bad back then. They get into a lot, like I said, a lot of creation of characters, the Silver Age, the Golden Age of comics. What makes DC DC? They talk about the creation of the Flash. Talk about the creation of the Flash, and pretty much like that just being like the first time they really had to like tap into like the multiverse, which I thought was pretty cool. They talk about DC kind of being the pioneer for the whole multiverse story and the parallel worlds due to like some events that were happening in the Flash and stuff like that, and how they were able to tell all different types of other stories because of this. I just really thought that it was interesting, getting into a lot of different creators like Jim Lee, Marv Wolfman, Jeff Johns, kind of like where their staples are in the history of DC Comics. We talk about, they even go into talk about how Marvel Comics was killing them. Marvel was killing them. 60s inspired. They just couldn't figure out why the heck Marvel was killing them like on the comic books. And I think they pretty much just figured out they were just out of touch. The comics were unrelatable at that time. Everybody felt like they was perfect. And you think about like a lot of the Marvel books, like everybody's flawed, everybody's fighting, everybody broke every week, but somehow they still have to manage to be a superhero. I don't think that was the case with DC at that time. Every book was almost a happy ending. There was almost no problems with their characters at that time. You rarely saw a flaw. There was not a lot of diversity at all in those comics. But you got to think about the time period it was in. I mean, talking about the early '60s. Man, you're hard pressed to get some black people in your books until Dwayne McDuffie and a lot of the crew came in. But it was early stuff that they tried to create, but pretty much they had to make a change, and they talk about that. But that's what I'm saying. I was just so surprised that in this documentary they were just pretty much like, look, we was trash. Like we need to keep up. Like our characters are cool, but they really go into detail in this documentary. Say it is the creator, the writer, and the artist. They have to push these comics to the next level. I mean, you can rely on the old stuff, but you also want to bring in something to do your old touch. You know what I mean? I know, a lot of comic book readers, they feel like the holy grail, the holy Bible, nothing can be changed, nothing can be touched. But I feel like, as they say here, in order for comics to survive, they have to evolve. They have to change. They have to bring something new, or less it becomes stale and people aren't reading. And the less people reading, the less of this you get. They talk about how pretty much the comics just became they didn't make money off of comics. They made money off of licensing toys. So they were pretty much making comics so they could produce toys. DC that's all they cared about. Like I said, at that time was money. The stories didn't matter. They just wanted them to create new characters so they could make new toys to sell in stores. And I'm sure merchandising was popping back then. You could probably get everything you can get. I mean, think about Batman bottle cap, oven opener, stuff like that. All types of stuff. Just getting to the point with DC where it kind of just didn't. It just wasn't enough. A lot of change wasn't happening. Marvel was killing them. They were just the number twos, you know what I mean, for a long time. This is until like 78, 79, when that Superman movie came out, and they talk about they were pretty much on the edge of like selling everything off, and just pretty much killing everything, and they had one final stretch with this movie. Superman movie came out and pretty much boom sales. And I've seen that a lot over the years too, especially as a comic book reader myself. When movies come out, it definitely affects how sales go. On the digital front, in the store, people want to know more about the characters. People want to know more about the surrounding stuff, because because the movie's over, doesn't mean you can't get new adventures. But I have noticed but at that time, like Superman, Christopher Reeve, and they go into like the directing process. That was almost a different movie apparently. I would love to just get a documentary just on the behind the scenes of Superman, the movie, and the people that they show, like the potential people like who could have been in the movie. But yeah, Superman saved their ass once again, from the edge of bankruptcy and God knows what. They get into Marv Wolfman, a lot of his creative on DC Universe. We get into a lot of Vertigo, Vertigo being created and having like a more edgy DC Universe, having like a kind of like an adult side, for the DC. We get Sandman and a bunch of other different, creations through Vertigo, which most people didn't even know that Vertigo was a within the DC wheelhouse, outside of people that read comic books, of course. And then, we get into like, they get into like a lot of the Comic Cons and realize that at a certain point, people really stopped reading them and they just started buying comic books as collectibles for money investments. They realized that their work was pretty much being used to make more money. And that's where they really get into like a lot of the collectible issues that started to come out, like the special bags. You get a card, you get a bunch of stuff in comics, variant issues. So if you go into your local comic book store and you see like the 25 of the same issue but a different cover, and it's like $40 more, this is the reason why. People buy comics, without the intention to not read them, but to actually flip it and make money. And it's a business like anything else. I mean, I can't be mad at that, but yeah, the fun and the value, like for personal reasons, I don't think it's there anymore for some people. But like I said, they get into that, very very much aware of like what's going on in the world, obviously, because I mean you got to respond to how your readers and these conventions and stuff go. And then like I said, dealing with that, they talk about the whole Death of Superman thing. Again, trying to one up the competition once again. Going to Neil Adams, George Perez. They get into that, giving them a little bit of a salute there. They talk about the creation of Milestone Media, which is just recently, finally getting to that. They get into the animated universe of DC, which I really appreciated. I feel like for a lot of people, DC animated that whole, Batman animated series, Batman Beyond, Justice League, Static Shock, all of those shows like really brought them into comics, probably. Really got them, with characters that they could relate to, that were familiar, had cool powers, had actual cool stories that were somewhat relatable. So like I said, shout out to everybody that worked on that. Matt Tim, Dwayne, everybody that was involved with the animation process and creation of those characters. Talk about a lot of comics you see back in 2001, probably like around 2001, 2002. You start to see a lot of excuse me, start to see a lot of comics talk about the whole 9/11 event, and we see them, really use comics to kind of give a little bit more of a positive light to those events, because I mean it's a super sad time, but just to see reissue that anybody can be heroes, and it's heroes outside of your door, your fire department, everybody that worked in those crisis environments. They get into like the whole media aspect of it, like the video games, more movies, how the movie again continue to save the ass, time after time, and so much more. The documentary, I highly recommend it. Not even just as a comic book fan, as a DC fan, I just think it's a really good look into this history of this company, and realizing, I think they realize like the mistakes they've made over the past, continue to innovate themselves, continue to find a way to keep themselves here. Because I mean, comic book publishers come and go. I mean, obviously you still see Marvel, DC, Image, like the big ones, that got the money, but it's one quick thing that can turn around and just dump everything. But a lot of the TV and movies is a big influence onto why a lot of this stuff is still here. Like I said, it's a three-part documentary just covering pretty much the beginning to present of DC. I want to say they probably filmed this like around 2002, but they pretty much get into a lot of everything. I'm sure it could have been longer if they wanted to get into a lot of stuff, but they definitely address a lot of important stuff here. And like I said, 80 years of DC history. I had a blast watching this. Like I said, I definitely recommend watching it for everybody. Shout out to Jim Lee for holding it down. Shout out to everybody that involved in DC like ever, that gave us what we have today. I mean, it's definitely none of this without our artists, our writers, anybody that has made any incredible impact to DC. So get a little bit of that, a little bit of DC. But yeah, I highly recommend this. Once it comes out, I'm not sure if they're going to do all 3 parts at once, but let me know what you think about in the comments. Let me know what you thought about it. If it really hit for you, if you're a big DC fan or whatever, if you just liked this documentary. I do, like I said, Superpowered, the DC story, coming to Max, three episodes, 55 minutes. Let me know what you thought about in the comments, and I'll see you next time for another review. See you.